In April 1912, she stood at Southampton ready for her maiden voyage. People walked beneath her towering hull. Dock workers moved along the quayside. Photographers aimed their cameras upward. Against her black steel sides, the figures of ordinary men looked remarkably small. She stretched nearly 883 feet from bow to stern. But only 3 years earlier, none of it existed. No funnels, no propellers, no grand staircase, not even a hull. Just an empty slipway in Belfast and a problem nobody had fully solved. The ship they were planning was so large that the shipyard itself would have to change first. I researched old plans, photos, and records for AI to reconstruct the entire build, stage by stage. So let me walk you through exactly how they pulled it off. And if you enjoy what you see, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The Olympic class began as an answer to a competitive problem. In 1907, White Star Line was watching its rival Cunard dominate the Atlantic with Lusitania and Mauretania, two fast liners built to win speed records and public admiration. White Star made a different bet. Rather than compete on speed, they would build ships known for size, comfort, and steady luxury. The crossing would not feel like endurance. It would feel like arrival. That idea became 3 ships. Olympic would launch first. Titanic would follow. A third sister, later named Britannic, would complete the group. To build them, White Star turned to Harland and Wolff in Belfast, a yard they had worked with closely for decades. Lord Peary, chairman of Harland and Wolff, was central to the plan. His chief designer, Thomas Andrews, had to turn the idea into drawings, measurements, steel orders, machinery specifications, and working instructions that thousands of men could actually follow. On paper, the ships looked achievable. In the yard, the problem was immediate. The Titanic would stretch more than 882 feet, far beyond what existing facilities could handle. Slipways, cranes, and working platforms had been built for smaller vessels. The shipyard could not simply begin construction and figure out the rest later. Before a single plate of the Titanic could be laid, the place itself had to be remade from the ground up. The solution was the Arrol Gantry, a steel framework designed by Sir William Arrol and Company that would tower over the construction site before the ships themselves had even started. It stretched roughly 840 feet along the yard and rose more than 200 feet above the ground. Beneath it, the Olympic and the Titanic would be built side by side. Above them, cranes and working platforms would carry steel frames, hull plates, tools, and men across the entire construction area at any height and any point along the hull. Photographs of the gantry alone are extraordinary. It does not look like scaffolding. It looks like a second structure being built over the ships. Workers stand on narrow beams high above the slipways, some appearing as tiny dark figures against the steel. Others are scattered along platforms while the frame expands section by section. There is little sense of the safety systems a modern viewer would expect. The men simply climbed, balanced, and kept working. From nearby streets across Belfast, people could already see the gantry rising above Harland and Wolff long before any ship existed beneath it. It was the first visible sign that something far beyond an ordinary build was coming. The shipyard had changed the Belfast skyline before Titanic had contributed a single piece of steel to it. Once complete, the structure gave the yard what it needed most: reach. Its cranes could place heavy steel at any point along a hull nearly the length of 9 football fields. Its clearance was high enough to handle ships larger than anything Harland and Wolff had previously attempted. By 1909, the stage was ready. On March 31, 1909, workers began laying down the first steel of yard number 401. The ship that would become the Titanic. No crowds gathered. No ceremony marked the occasion. Beneath the gantry, workers simply got to work. The first steel sections were brought into position and lowered onto slipway number 3. These components formed the keel, the backbone of the future vessel. Everything that would follow, from the hull frames to the passenger decks, would be built upon this foundation. Looking at photographs from these earliest days, the slipway looks almost empty. There is no ship, just a line of steel stretching across an open workspace. It is nearly impossible, looking at those images today, to imagine that this quiet, unremarkable scene would eventually produce one of the most recognized vessels in history. But every measurement mattered from the start. Surveyors moved through the site checking alignments. Engineers reviewed plans. Workers carefully positioned each section before securing it in place. Over a distance of more than 882 feet, even a small error in the foundation would create serious problems months later when the hull was under full load. This was patient work, invisible work, the kind that rarely attracts attention, but determines whether everything that follows holds together. More steel arrived, more sections were added, and although the ship still existed mostly as lines on drawings and calculations on paper, something important had changed. The Titanic was no longer an idea. For the first time, she occupied a physical place in the world. Now, the task was to build upward. Once the keel was in place, the ship began climbing into view. Steel frames arrived at the slipway and were lifted into position beneath the Arrol Gantry. One after another, the curved sections were secured to the keel, creating the basic shape of the hull. Each frame added another piece to the outline of the future liner. Photographs taken through 1909 and 1910 tell the story better than any description. What had been an open slipway became a maze of steel columns, beams, and cross supports. The spaces between the frames filled with additional structure, and the profile of the ship became easier to recognize with every passing month. For the first time, people outside the project could see what Harland and Wolff was actually building. One photograph from this period stopped me during research. At first glance, it looks like a scale model. Then you notice the tiny figures scattered throughout the structure. Workers are standing on beams, climbing through openings, and moving through sections that would later become some of the most famous spaces on the ship. Those men are not standing inside a finished vessel. They are standing inside its skeleton. In some images, sunlight passes completely through the hull. Looking from one side to the other, you can see clear-through spaces that would eventually become dining rooms, passenger cabins, and corridors. Future public areas exist only as open frameworks exposed to the Belfast sky. That is what thousands of workers were climbing through every morning. An enormous open cage of steel, growing larger every week. As the structure rose higher and stretched further, the Titanic was no longer confined to drawings. She had become a visible presence in the city. And the challenge now was turning that open framework into a single structure capable of carrying thousands of passengers across the Atlantic. The Titanic's framework gave the ship her shape. But shape alone was not enough. Every frame, beam, and plate had to be fastened securely enough to hold together at sea, under load, in Atlantic swells. In the early 20th century, that work was done with rivets, not welding, not bolts. Millions of small metal fasteners driven through overlapping steel by hand and by machine, one at a time. The process was straightforward and relentless. A rivet was heated until it glowed red, then carried or thrown to the workers waiting at the hull. One man placed it through a prepared hole. Another held it steady from one side, while riveters on the other end shaped the metal with heavy hammers or pneumatic tools until it locked tightly against the plates. Then they moved to the next hole. At peak construction, rivet teams were working across multiple sections of the ship simultaneously. The sound must have been constant. Hammer blows ringing through steel, pneumatic tools shaking against the hull, cranes moving overhead. Hundreds of these repeated actions happening at once, turning the slipway into a relentless rhythm of heat, noise, and metal. This was skilled work, and it was physically punishing. Men worked around hot metal, exposed heights, heavy tools, and steel surfaces that offered no room for error. At its peak, Harland and Wolff employed many thousands of workers across the yard. Riveters, shipwrights, engineers, electricians, carpenters, plumbers, painters, crane operators, and laborers. The Titanic was not built by one designer or one famous name. She was built through millions of repeated tasks performed over more than 3 years by people whose names almost never appear in any account of the ship. Most of their names are not attached to the images that survive. but their presence remains in every frame, every plate, and every fastener. As the riveting continued, the open framework began to close. Spaces that had once revealed daylight through the hull were covered by steel plates. The skeleton was disappearing. The ship was taking on her outer skin. By 1910, anyone looking into the Harland Wolff yard could see the outline of a real ship. The frames were in place. The hull stretched across the slipway. Titanic's shape was no longer hidden inside engineering drawings. What remained was the task of enclosing it. Steel plates arrived and were lifted into position by the gantry cranes overhead. Once aligned, riveting crews secured each plate to the framework beneath. For months, the ship had resembled an open steel cage. Now that view began to close. Every newly plated section covered another part of the structure, replacing open spaces with solid steel. Some of the best photographs from this phase almost look like before and after images taken at the same moment. One section of the hull appears nearly complete, while a section nearby remains exposed, revealing the rows of frames and supports beneath. You can watch the ship changing from open structure to enclosed vessel within a single frame. The transformation was becoming visible far beyond the shipyard walls. People across Belfast could now recognize the growing liner from a distance. The hull rose steadily above surrounding buildings, and the familiar profile that would later appear in photographs around the world was beginning to emerge for the first time. By 1911, the Titanic was no longer hidden inside Harland Wolff. The unfinished liner had become part of Belfast's industrial skyline. From nearby streets and yards, people could look toward the shipyard and see her standing beneath the gantry. She was still unfinished, but she already looked permanent, and she was about to move for the first time. On May 31st, 1911, crowds gathered around the yard to watch the Titanic enter the water for the first time. She had spent more than 2 years on the slipway. Her hull was complete enough to float, but she was still far from a finished ship. No completed interiors, no working passenger spaces, no machinery ready for service. What Belfast saw that day was not a finished ocean liner. It was a vast steel hull weighing more than 24,000 tons, prepared for the next stage of its build. The launch had been planned carefully. Beneath the hull, workers had applied roughly 22 tons of lubricant, a mixture of tallow, soft soap, and oil, across the launchways to allow the hull to slide toward Belfast Lough without friction stopping her. At that weight, every detail had to be controlled. Photographs from that day show crowds packed around the yard and gathered at every available viewpoint. People stood near the slipways. Others watched from nearby buildings and rooftops. For Belfast, this was not simply a shipyard event. It was the moment the city watched one of its greatest industrial projects move for the first time. Shortly after noon, the final restraints were released. The Titanic began to slide. After more than 2 years of construction, the movement itself lasted just over 60 seconds. The hull moved down the greased ways and entered the water while the crowd watched from the shore. What stands out in the launch photographs is the calm of the workers closest to the ship. The crowd had come for a spectacle, but many of the men in the yard look focused rather than amazed. They had built the hull. They had prepared the launch. Now they were watching the next step unfold exactly as planned. But here is the detail that most accounts gloss over. The launch was not the end of construction, not even close. Engines, funnels, propellers, interiors, wiring, and all the passenger spaces that would eventually fill the newspapers still required months of additional work. The hull was afloat. The floating construction site was about to begin. After the launch, the Titanic was moved to the fitting-out berth. From a distance, she already looked close to complete. To anyone watching from the shore, the hardest work might have seemed finished. It was not. For nearly 10 more months, the Titanic was a floating construction site. Inside the hull, workers installed the machinery that would make her move under her own power. 2 large 4-cylinder triple-expansion steam engines and a low-pressure turbine placed further aft. In engine room photographs from this period, men stand beside components that rise above them like factory machinery. The inside of the ship was still a heavy industrial work site. Above deck, the 4 funnels were fitted one by one, transforming the entire silhouette of the vessel. 3 were connected to the boiler exhaust system. The 4th served ventilation and helped preserve the visual profile that the public expected of a great Atlantic liner. At the stern, the 2 wing propellers measured more than 23 feet across. In photographs, the workers standing beneath the blades look almost like they were placed there specifically to prove the scale is real. Inside the ship, craftsmen were building the world passengers would actually see. Cabins were fitted out, corridors took shape, public rooms were finished with woodwork, glass, metal fittings, upholstery, lighting, plumbing, and ventilation. Electricians ran wiring through the entire vessel. The grand staircase, remembered today as one of the Titanic's most iconic interiors, was at this point an active construction site filled with timber, tools, ladders, and craftsmen. That contrast defines the fitting out stage. Outside, the Titanic looked increasingly complete. Inside, workers were still building a city room by room. Behind every finished surface was the work of people whose names rarely appear in the famous story of the ship. By early April 1912, the vessel was ready, machinery in place, funnels and propellers fitted, interiors complete, systems tested. The hull that had been laid quietly on slipway number 3 on an ordinary morning in 1909 had become the largest ship in the world. 3 years, tens of thousands of workers, millions of rivets, a gantry built before the ship was, a keel laid without ceremony, a hull launched before it was finished, and 10 more months of construction before she was ready for the water. The Titanic is almost always remembered for what happened across 4 hours in April 1912. She is almost never remembered for the 3 years it took to build her in Belfast, or the engineering problem that had to be solved just to create the slipway she stood on, or the thousands of workers who built her piece by piece and never made it into the story. That is the part that gets forgotten every time the disaster gets told again. If this caught your attention, hit subscribe and give this video a like. And let me know in the comments, what city, era, or building do you want me to cover next? I'll see you in the next video.